So hello, everyone. Welcome to the 2025 EBSS Research Forum. This forum offers librarians an opportunity to present current research, especially research that is relevant to librarianship and education and behavioral sciences. My name is Thomas Weeks, and I am the chair of the EBSS Research Committee, which organizes this event each year. In case you are new to EBSS, we are the Education and Behavioral Sciences section of ACRL. Formed in 1968, EBSS has about 1,000 members, and we always welcome new members who are interested in education and behavioral sciences librarianship. Before we get started and jump into the presentations, I'd like to acknowledge this year's research committee, myself as chair, Emily Fornwald as vice chair, Catherine Donaldson, Kimberly Y. Franklin, and Neil Grimes, many of whom are here today in attendance. So thank you very much for serving this year and for helping put this great forum together. So this is the list of presentations we'll be seeing today. We will go in this order. So, take notes of your favorite. We will have all of the Q&A at the end. Whoops, I'm going a little ahead of myself here. I'm going to stop my sharing. Today's presentations were selected via a competitive open peer review process. During this process, the committee looks for original research that measured or investigated issues of high impact and interest to education and behavioral sciences librarians. We also evaluated each proposal's research design and analysis, relevance and value, and innovation, as well as their research impacts on diverse communities. Each presenter will have 10 to 15 minutes to present. During each presentation, please share any questions you have in the chat, and I'll ask them during the question and answer section after all four have presented. At the end of the forum, I'll also share a link to the presentation slides as well as a survey for feedback. With that, we'll go ahead and get started with our first presentation.
All right, my screen should be sharing.
Yes.
Awesome. All right, this is the first presentation. This is selecting a specialized education database for literature reviews and evidence synthesis projects. My name is Alissa Droog, she, her pronouns, and I work at Northern Illinois University as an education librarian.
And I'm Sarah Fitzgerald, and I work at the University of Massachusetts Amherst as the assessment and planning librarian.
And I'm Kari Weaver. I am currently the program manager for artificial intelligence and machine learning at the Ontario Council of University Libraries on a 2-year secondment from my permanent role as the learning, teaching, and instructional design librarian at the University of Waterloo.
Awesome. So this presentation is about a project that actually recently got published in Research Synthesis Methods on selecting specialized databases for education. You might be wondering why we did this. I'm going to start with a bit of a story. So Fitz, Kari, and I got together about 2 years ago, and we had a question. We all work with education researchers on literature reviews and evidence synthesis projects. And we kept wondering, what databases should we be suggesting to these researchers? We actually didn't have any evidence-based findings on how to make that decision and how to help other people make that decision. So we wanted to create those findings and make them public because we wanted people to be able to find them. So we started on this project a couple of years ago. It recently got published, which we're really excited about, and we're hoping that it starts a conversation about making evidence-based decisions on database selection. For some background, evidence synthesis, systematic reviews, etc. These types of projects have been growing in the field of education for a couple of decades now. And database selection is a really important component, both for systematic reviews, but also for literature reviews, because the databases you select are going to determine which types of articles you read and how you make those decisions and maybe the analysis and the results, which might impact policy or decisions in the classroom. So there are far-reaching impacts to what databases we choose to select. The other thing we noticed is that Database comparison studies are kind of moved out of the vogue a while ago. They were common for a while, but we really haven't seen a lot of them in the last 10 to 20 years. Although they really are useful because they allow researchers to make informed decisions about database selection. So I've got 3 points that I just want to make from our literature review when we were looking at the literature for this study. So first, ERIC, the Educational Resources Information Center, which has been in the news quite a lot right now because we're not quite sure what's happening with it, is by far the most popular education database. It has been recommended for decades now and is used really popularly. It's recommended in guidelines for evidence synthesis from the Institute of Educational Sciences itself and from various research publications. However, none of those recommendations necessarily have that evidence backing to know that it's the best. It's just this is the most popular, and it's been so popular that we just keep saying it's really popular. Second, while dated, previous studies have not necessarily favored ERIC and have often recommended it to be used with other databases. So one of our most recent comparison analysis is from 2008, so a little bit dated, was recommending that ERIC's coverage of a lot of journals in education weren't actually enough on its own and that it needed to be used with other databases. So what we could find, although old, was already saying that ERIC might not be the only database we should be using in the field. The third thing that we found is that ERIC has some limitations when it comes to evidence synthesis work in particular. There are 3. 2 of them come directly from its content selection policy. First, since it is run by the Institute of Educational Sciences and part of the US government, it has a geographic focus on the United States. It does not necessarily try to index materials that are international or outside of the United States in any scope. Second, ERIC has a selective indexing policy, which took us a while to figure out how this works. Basically, the journals that ERIC says it indexes, we don't know, and they do not tell us, even if you work with them for a bit, whether or not every single article from every single journal that they index is being included in the database. They might pick and choose selectively articles from each of the journals they do index, which causes problems because we don't always know if we're searching everything from a journal or not, which is a little different from a lot of our other databases. Third, there are some performance limitations from the public version, the Institute of Educational Sciences version of their platform for ERIC. When we're doing evidence synthesis work, we need to be able to do really complex search strings. And that version of that platform doesn't really give us that, the ability to do that really well. Whereas platforms like EBSCO do a better job of that, but there's a lag in getting articles out of ERIC and into the EBSCO platform. So there's pros and cons, but there are performance limitations. And I'm going to pass it over to Kari to talk about our research questions.
So this background and what we found when we did the literature review really led us to ask a couple of key research questions. First, what are the journal coverage overlaps of specialized education databases? And we really wanted to focus just on the education databases in this particular project. We're happy to take questions later about why that is, but we won't get into details at this moment. And second, what are the implications of these journal coverage overlaps for selecting the specialized education databases that you might need as part of research in education? So, moving along, I will send it over to Fitz to talk about how we developed the methodology.
Thanks, Kari. So we started out with the idea of 13 education databases, but we narrowed our scope a bit down because, for one thing, some of the vendors like EBSCO have many different education databases available, and they're all subsets of each other. So we wanted to pick the largest set of databases from EBSCO, and then we also eliminated some specialized databases that focus just on administrative issues in education or British education that weren't necessarily what someone would pick if they were trying to do a comprehensive literature review or evidence synthesis project. And then we ended up with 4 databases to review: Education Source from EBSCO, Education Database from ProQuest, ERIC from the Institute of Education Sciences, and Educator's Reference from Gale. And we ran into some title list challenges when we were trying to compare the coverage. It wasn't always clear which databases were indexing, you know, which journals were listed in an education's database's title list or not. So like, for instance, ERIC doesn't keep track of journals that are no longer in print or journals it's no longer indexing. So there's some data issues there. And then another issue is that the genre of publication is not always identical across databases, right? One database might call something an academic journal while another calls it a trade journal. So we were a little bit more inclusive with what we analyzed. So we think that in education, people tend to include practitioner journals because it's a applied field. And so those journals are often relevant to their literature searching. So we included them. And then we started an ISN level coverage comparison. So first we did the ISSN or EISSN comparison using VLOOKUP in Excel. And then for the titles that didn't have an ISSN number, we did a manual match, and we you know, reviewed them together as researchers to make sure there was inter-rater reliability, ensuring that matches were really matches and non-matches were really non-matches. And then one thing I wanted to mention is although it's possible to use like a vendor platform for coverage analysis, and this analysis is not gonna, you know, is a snapshot in time and won't last forever. We thought this was important because education scholars don't have the same resources librarians do, right? They don't have access to a vendor coverage analysis platform. They don't necessarily have the familiarity with or the time for doing their own coverage analysis. So we thought it was important to do it on their behalf. You can go to the next slide. Okay, so when we're thinking about the outcomes of our study, what you can see here in this graph is the blue indicates titles that were covered by all 4 databases, right? It's pretty small, about 200 titles covered by all 4. And you can see that Education Source from EBSCO is by far the most inclusive database with the most titles covered, and that ERIC, in fact, has the fewest in yellow unique journals of any of the 4 databases. So it's not really appropriate to choose ERIC as your only education database if you're just going to use one. Like, preferably you would use more than one, but if you have to use just one, then Education Source would be the better choice. And then I will let Kari take it away.
So out of our analysis, that second research question is really thinking about the implications for educational researchers engaging in this kind of research. We would highly recommend, based on our analysis, choosing your databases carefully and really thinking about and clearly justifying that choice. Second, as Fitz just mentioned, stop relying on ERIC as your only education database. The evidence doesn't support doing that. And we would highly recommend using more than one specialized education database. So if ERIC is one that is available to you, using that in combination with another specialized education database will result in a more comprehensive search. So with that, thank you everyone for your attention, and we're delighted to have questions a little later in the presentation, and we'll turn it back over to the hosts.
Thank you all. Very interesting research. We'll go ahead and move on to the next presentation, which is Lisa. Okay, we can see your screen. Great, thank you.
Great. Okay, great, thank you. And thank you for that last presentation. That's very helpful for me. So I'm super excited to read the whole paper and study. So my name is Alissa Cheby, and I am the education librarian at California State University Northridge, and I'm going to be sharing a study, the impact of high school library staffing on college success. My co-PI on this paper, which is right now we're in the revision process for publication. My co-PI is Dr. Laura Wimberly. She's our assessment librarian and research instruction and outreach services chair here at CSUN. She's unfortunately on leave right now, so I'm on my own today in the presentation. So our statement of research problems, the two questions that this study address is there a difference in GPA and credits earned in college-based on library staffing in high school of the incoming students? And what is the relevant impact compared to other factors like gender, income, and first generation status? So this study came out of looking at 3 areas of concern: media literacy crisis, that we see that in the news. Recently in California, we've had several bills addressing media literacy and AI literacy in K-12 education to better prepare students for college, work, and citizenship. In 2022, NATO declared the lack of media literacy education a global threat. And way back in 2010, the California Department of Education adopted model school library standards in response to concerns over declines in literacy and increased need for new media literacy skills. We also see gaps in college students' information literacy skills, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in the literature review. And a decline in school library funding and staffing, also since 2010. And in particularly in California, which now ranks last in teacher librarian to student ratio. So just a few highlights from the literature review. We looked at 3 areas in the literature review. First are, again, those literacy gaps in higher education with information competency skills. And we see that, that the evidence of this from the Educational Testing Service iSkill test 2007 through 2018. The test is no longer active, but in that time period, the test was developed to evaluate if these concerns were in fact real, and showed that students, even as they were tech savvy, they lacked the critical thinking skills and mindsets needed for college level research. More recently, in a 2022 study by J.C. Matthews, students self-reported that they felt that there was a gap between what they learned in high school. Oh, sorry, that's the next study. Sorry, my notes. So in the J.C. Matthews study, they studied perceptions of student bias, and only a minority of students had strong enough information literacy skills such as seeking out alternative point of views of their own bias, or assuming that outlets are biased in that study of whether or not they had the skills to identify bias in sources. And then the 23 study, Boyer and Dedzik-Elliott, that's where students were asked to evaluate their information literacy skills themselves, and they identified a gap in what they were taught in high school versus what's expected of them in college. We also have the second area that we looked at was the role of school libraries in student achievement. So these studies are just looking within the K through 12 environment, not the transition to college. And we have 2 major studies, 2004 from Sinclair, Tar and Char, and 2008 from Achterman. And both of these are studies in California schools and showed a positive relationship between the presence of school librarians or school library staffing and student achievement, particularly on reading test scores. So Sinclair, Tar and Char, they looked at the California Content Standards Test and California Achievement Test, and found that correlation in elementary and middle school, though not in high school. And Achterman found that throughout the K through 12 environment. We also have 2 studies, the Library Research Service in 2013 and one from Lance and Kotchell, 2018. These compiled school library studies from various states, 22 for the Library Research Service and 26 state studies from Lance and Kochel that were comparing student performance data to state tests and the state staffing information to demonstrate, and they all demonstrated a correlation between student achievement and the presence of teacher librarians. As you can see the visual here showing that the presence of a librarian on campus has that positive impact on scores. And moreover, the Sinclair Tar and Char study, the Lance and Kochel 2018 study, and another study by Lance and Maniotis in 2020 draw a link between integrated teacher librarian instruction and performance on reading scores. So that relationship is even stronger if they can show that there's actual collaboration between teacher librarians and teachers. And then the final area we looked at in our literature review was the what do we know about how those skills carry over from high school to college? And in fact, that we have a relationship between school libraries and student achievement within the K through 12 environment. And we know that teacher librarians are the credentialed teachers to teach information literacy, which includes media literacy and now AI literacy. And we know that information literacy is important for student success in college, but there's not many studies that really look at how that, how the impact of what's happening in the high school level as far as information literacy carries over. There is a study by Crawford and Irving in 2007 that correlates high library usage in college to increase GPA and more successful progress towards degree completion. And then in 2021, there's the Farmer and Fommel study, which did find a highly significant correlation between the presence of at least a half-time teacher librarian in high school and student GPA in their first year at university. And so this is where we started to build our study. So in our study, we looked at first-year CSUN students. So CSUN is a large urban public university. The majority of our students are eligible for Pell Grants, and we are recognized as a Hispanic serving institution. And we primarily serve local students from the greater Los Angeles region. So our first-year student, we looked at our first-year student population in fall 2022. We eliminated students under 21 just because we figure if they're coming, if there's that gap between high school and college, then the impact of that school library experience, couldn't be guaranteed. There could be other influences in there. We also excluded any students who were from out-of-state high schools or international students due to the difficulty in collecting the data about school library staffing for out-of-state and international schools. And then we also added in information about free and reduced lunch. And this led us to eliminate private schools for which that information is not available. So in the end, we had a sample of 3,036, which is 63% of the total students, first-year students of that year. And we got all this information came from the California State University Northridge Office of Institutional Research. We looked at grade point average and credits earned for fall 2022. And our control variables, which was also information that came with the information from the Office of Institutional Research, includes racial and ethnic group for underserved populations, eligibility for Pell Grants, gender, and for whether or not students were first generation status. And again, we received the information about free lunch eligibility. We found that from the Department of Education's free lunch priced, reduced priced data. And our independent variable school library staffing, this data came from the California Department of Education Library Survey, which is completed by schools or school districts. Many of the schools did not complete the survey, so we isolated schools without data from which we had a statistically significant number of students in our sample, and then we just called those schools directly to gather that information. We recorded if each school had a teacher librarian, classified library staff at full-time status, and coded that with numbers 0 for none, 0.5 for half, 1 for full-time, and so on. And then we also separately coded 1 for any combination of teacher library or teacher librarian or classified library staffing. So any type of staffing would have a 1, and if they had no staffing at all, that had a 0. So in our results, we did find that most students did come from a school with library staffing. Some of their, only about 16% had no library staffing at all, and about 66.7% had some kind of teacher librarian staffing versus just classifying. We used a TOBA analysis because both of these, the GPA and credits earned are constrained, so they cannot go below 0. And we looked at, to determine the variable, we looked at the coefficients. So in our findings, as you can see here, any school, any library staffing at high school had a significant impact both on GPA and credit hours earned. So for credit hours earned, this variable has the largest positive impact and indicates that having any type of library staffing positively impacts the student GPA. So a student attended a high school with no library would have a C average, and students who attended high school with any library staffing had a C+ average. On credit hours earned, you can see that on average, they earned about an additional credit if they came from a high school with school library staffing. At CSUN expects 15 credits each semester to graduate in 4 years. So we can see that that could possibly impact students' ability to complete their degree in a timely manner. So again, our key findings are any type of school library staffing showed the greatest positive impact on both GPA and credit earned. And this is more significant. I'm going to go back to the other slide just for a second. What you'll notice that this is more significant, a bigger difference than that of the impact of gender, of first generation status, Pell eligibility, which are all considered factors that are considered in predicting or being a cause for intervention, perhaps for students to make sure that they progress in a timely manner towards their degree. And this also confirmed the Farmer and Fommel study and highlight the importance of school library staffing in K-12 and particularly high schools. So some possibilities or implications for policy and education, advocacy for accountability for library staffing in school libraries, considering staffing when considering how to improve literacy and information literacy in our K-12 schools. Unlike some of the other factors like first generation status or gender, this is a variable that we can control, and legislators and policymakers should also consider the presence and support for school libraries, including staffing in bills addressing media, AI, and information literacy. In higher educations, counselors and faculty and librarians might consider this in things like course design, recommendations for courses, freshman orientation programs, perhaps requiring library visits or brief introductions for all freshman courses, knowing that some students might not have had access or exposure to library programs. And in our teacher preparation programs, including information literacy instruction and library collaboration within those preparation programs. And this is a definitely a place where educational librarians could take on a leadership role. And then recommendations for further research. I'm going to leave that there because I think I'm out of time, and but I look forward to your questions and appreciate any comments or insights you might have. So thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. We appreciate your presentation there. So our next presentation will be Teresa, Emily, and Elena.
Yes, hello everyone. Hi, my name is Teresa Schultz. I am the Scholarly Communications and Social Sciences Librarian at the University of Nevada, Reno. I am here with my colleagues, Elena Azadbakht, who is the Health Sciences Librarian, and Emily Boss, who is the head of Metadata Cataloging and One-Time Acquisition. We're going to talk about a research project we have been recently working on called Exploring How Promotion and Tenure Documents Define and Evaluate Scholarship for Academic Librarians. So really the impetus for this project, UNR is a tenure granting institution for librarians. We, all three of us actually have recently gone successfully through the tenure process. And certainly we all had questions and our colleagues have had questions and we've heard from other librarians, you know, when it comes to promotion and tenure, what counts as scholarship? How do academic libraries define scholarship? And then what criteria do they use to evaluate it? And we also noticed there was a gap in the literature looking at what the actual documentation around promotion and tenure processes and policies say about this. So you were really interested in looking more into that. So about our methodology, we did opt to focus on R1 libraries at R1 institutions because UNR is an R1 institution ourselves and we are interested in what other R1s do. We wanted to focus on those R1 libraries that offer tenure or what we're going to call indefinite continuing appointment for their librarians. And so we're making that specific definition for continuing appointment because we noticed some of those that say they have continuing appointment, they still have to go up for review every 5 years. So we were focusing on those where it was indefinite once you received continuing appointment. There are several lists of R1 libraries out there and tenure status, although there's a little bit, mixed quality. So we ended up doing our own check. We were able to confirm that 56 of the R1s. And I should note here also, this work was done last year. So this was before the most recent update to the Carnegie listings, the classifications, and when they added about another 40 institutions to the R1 classification. So this is prior to that. So we were working with a slightly smaller group. But we were able to confirm that 56 of the libraries offered tenure to their librarians, and then 13 offered this idea of indefinite continuing appointment. Once we had our list of libraries we were working with, we then searched their websites, both the library and the institutional website, for any mention of any documentation relating to processes and policies in regards to tenure and promotion. We counted it as long as it mentioned librarians specifically. It could be formal documentation, and often was, such as bylaws and faculty handbooks, but it also could be more informal documentation, so just maybe guidelines or something like that. If we could not find it publicly available on a website, we then reached out to someone at the library to ask if they would send us a copy of the documentation. From these two methods, we were able to gather documentation for 48 of the institutions with tenure and 11 with continuing appointment, for a total of 59 institutions out of a potential 69 institutions. Once we had the documentation, we took a handful of them, started reading through, and just then also based on our research questions, started creating inductively our code book. What were we seeing? What criteria were often being mentioned for how scholarship gets evaluated, the different types of scholarship, and then just anything else we really noticed related to scholarship. Scholarship was our focus, and especially for that initial promotion and or tenure. Once we had a code book, we randomly selected 3 institutions' documentations. All 3 of us coded it independently. We then came together, discussed any discrepancies, further refined our code book, tried to clarify our definitions. In some cases, we decided, what we thought might be a common code, we probably wouldn't end up being one, and so we might delete it or combine it. We would, try and provide more details as to when to use a code, when not to use a code, etc. And then from there on out, each institution's documentations was assigned to 2 reviewers who, again, coded it independently, came together at the end. We discussed any discrepancies. If the 2 reviewers couldn't, meet, come to a consensus, then the 3rd person was brought in. We did use TagGet for our coding. If you're not familiar with it, it's a free open source qualitative coding program that is very simple and easy to use. And now I'm going to pass it off to my colleague, Emily.
So the first thing we looked at was quality criteria. Basically, how were they evaluating the quality of scholarship in these documents? Probably unsurprisingly, the number one thing we saw was peer review. That was in 82% of the documents, but that also means there were R1 institutions that did not mention peer review at all in their bylaws or handbooks. Geographic distribution was in 50% of the documents. This could have been the venue of the scholarship. So it could be like an international or national journal that they were choosing, but it could also have been maybe the reputation of the scholarship or of the scholar. Originality was also a really high one. I have a little snippet here of what some documents said about originality. These are new observations, new concepts, and new interpretations related to the individual's scholarly endeavors. So really high on originality, which is interesting in the library science field. And then another high one was quantity. So this is just any mention of quantity. It could have just been as vague as, quality is better than quantity. But there were some documents that gave a numerical amount in terms of quantity. In those documents, 3 minimum was the most common, followed by 5, followed by 4. So the next thing we looked at was the types of scholarship that were being considered. If you've read any bylaws, usually there's a long list of what you can do and what counts. So we wanted to look at that as well. Surprising to us, we really thought the journal article was going to be the top one. These are just the top 3. Of course, there is a longer list in our article. But conference materials was really the highest for us. So papers, posters, or presentations at conferences. And then journal articles, and then followed by grants. Grants was really interesting about the language that was used in in counting grants towards scholarship. Sometimes it was like being awarded a grant. Sometimes it was awarded or unawarded grants. There was at least one institution that said, even if you write a grant, you don't have to submit it, but even if you wrote it, you got counted for it. And then we also looked at things that were not quality indicators and not types, but there was a lot of language around scholarship in these documents. So we just picked out a few that we thought were really interesting. For me, rubrics was a really big thing. When I joined an R1 institution, a lot of people I knew were like, you're going to have a rubric. Actually, rubrics only appeared in 9 documents, and they weren't specifically rubrics, I think, as we would think of them. They were more commonly something like this. Here's an example. Lists of major or minor works with slight tweaks. And then it would say something like you need 1 major work and 1 minor work per year or something like that. Also something like national versus regional or state. So again, if you were choosing like a national journal and then you were doing like a regional presentation, something like that. And then we also saw some ranked lists that we included as rubric-like. So here's an example here where the gold standard is a scholarly book, followed by articles in refereed professional and scholarly journals. And now I'll turn it over to Elena to continue our results.
Another big theme we encountered was the mention of interdisciplinary research, and it appeared in 63% of the document, so a large number. And it was generally viewed, not surprisingly, as a positive thing that was encouraged, especially for liaison librarians or anyone whose primary role sort of interacted with interdisciplinary research. Many stipulated that a librarian's entire body of work couldn't lie entirely outside of LIS. So you had to have something related to our field, but they did encourage it and allow it. And then a few specified that interdisciplinary research is allowed, but only if it relates in some way to your primary assignment. So if you're an evidence synthesis librarian, if you're helping with those and getting publications, that's great, but you had to make the case that it was related. Another big theme was collaboration. So 34% of the institutions discussed collaborative research in their documents. And again, generally seen as a positive, with some saying explicitly that librarianship is by nature and necessity collaborative. So this is encouraged. And you can see here, example, much of the advancement of librarianship depends on formal cooperative efforts. And 11 of these documents say that collaborative and independent scholarships are weighted equally. So it didn't matter if you did something on your own and published it or presented on your own versus with colleagues. And others said that you had to have at least some independent research of some kind. You couldn't just do collaborative works all the time. Another thing that we saw that we were personally interested in, it was pretty small, relatively speaking, but about 19% of institutions mentioned open access when it came to scholarship. And they discussed how it was handled. And just like with the other two things, it was generally encouraged that librarians publish open access when they had the ability to, but a lot of them said too that while it was valued, it wasn't required, and that they treated open access and non-open access publications as essentially the same when it came to tenure and promotion decisions. And then finally, what are some of our takeaways? And again, we go into this in much more detail in our forthcoming article. But when writing or updating your own P&T documentation, if you're in charge of that, use clear, unambiguous language whenever and wherever possible. We realize that sometimes you're constrained by your institution's requirements. Maybe your legal team says you have to use certain boilerplate, but wherever possible, we had instances where we all kind of interpret things different ways. So when things are vague, that makes it harder for someone in trying to interpret these criteria. And again, also too, in a similar vein, explicitly define any criteria or provide examples of what constitutes excellent or what counts. So if you want, if you think journal articles are the primary thing you're going to evaluate librarians on, be sure to mention that as an example. And then try to include any assessment criteria in your actual documents that your library uses in practice. So documentation should reflect actual practice on the ground. So update your bylaws regularly and make sure they are aligned. Again, obviously you may be tied in terms of like bylaws of including certain language, but you could have informal documentation that goes along with your bylaws that kind of go into some of this that helps actual librarians. And then we saw like interdisciplinary research, collaboratory research, and publishing in OA venues was generally seen as a positive elsewhere. So we encourage you to include these things in your own documentation. Here's our contact information, and our article is going to come out in the May 2026 issue of CRL. So we have a long time to wait, but hopefully you'll find the fuller report of interest as well.
Thank you so much for that information. We really appreciate you presenting your research for us. The next presentation is from Natalia and Maria. If you'd like to share your screen and get started.
Good afternoon, everyone, and my name is Natalia Tomlin. I'm an associate professor at Long Island University LIU Post Campus, and I'm here with my colleague Maria Zarycky. I'm gonna go through the first part of the presentation, and then Maria is gonna pick up after a few slides. First, we would like to thank EBSS for giving us the opportunity to present our research on curriculum material centers and collections in the U.S. academic libraries. And we started this exploratory study because we noticed a clear gap in research on curriculum material centers and collections, and the need for a large-scale data-driven study that captures broader trends across institutions. We were curious how the curriculum material centers function right now and what kind of shared challenges and opportunities they're currently experiencing. We were really encouraged by the response to our survey. The 38.5% response rate gave us a really solid cross-section of institutions, from small colleges to large universities. Our survey used skip logic, and that allowed us to tailor follow-up responses based on each respondent's role and responsibilities. We viewed our sample using the 8th edition of the EBSS Directory of Curriculum Material Centers and Collections, and we would like to thank EBSS for continuing maintaining this resource. As we designed the study, we realized that we needed to distinguish between two models. A curriculum material center, which refers to a designated physical space housing curriculum materials located either in the main library or a school of education, and the curriculum material collection, which may be integrated into the general library collection. And let's look first, look at who responded to our survey and what it tells us about how curriculum material centers and curriculum collections are being supported. So only about a quarter of the respondents worked in a standalone curriculum material center, and the majority, that's about 75%, were education liaison librarians or subject specialist librarians who worked with curriculum materials, but they also have additional work responsibilities. So when curriculum materials duties are just one function within a library broader responsibilities, those activities often compete with time and visibility. And in fact, 83% of respondents had the duties outside the CMC, and almost half said that they spent less than 25% of their work time working with curriculum materials. That said, there was a strong level of expertise. 70% of our respondents had a degree in education, and nearly 1 in 5 had over a decade of experience working with curriculum materials or curriculum materials collections. About 43% worked at institutions with enrollment over 10,000 students, but we also heard from librarians who worked at smaller colleges with much lower enrollment, which gave us a more well-rounded view of the field. So the staffing looked similar regardless of institution size. Most curriculum materials centers and curriculum materials collections are managed just by one professional librarian, and with little or no professional support, and a heavy reliance on student workers. So significant finding from our survey was how central information literacy is still in the work of curriculum material centers and education librarians. We expected to see more frequent use of online formats, especially asynchronous format, but most librarians indicated they only occasionally use online platform when teaching. This might reflect institutional expectations or lack of adequate technological infrastructure, or librarians' preference for face-to-face interaction, especially when it comes to supporting the pre-service teachers. Subject-specific database instruction emerged as the most common offering, especially at larger institutions. The emphasis on databases likely reflects the subject-specific nature of pre-service teacher assignments, which may range from research papers to lesson plans and requiring some discipline-specific resources. The technology resources supporting the instruction provided by CMC librarians and education librarians vary considerably across institutions. Most of the curriculum centers in our research, they did have labs. They offered desktop computers and collaborative tools like a Google Workspace, but fewer provided more interactive resources such as smart boards. We also asked if education technology instruction occurred when there was no tech lab, and the responses were mixed. Some librarians use general classrooms in the library, and 40% said they didn't offer education technology instruction at all. And that's a high percentage, especially considering how vital classroom technology has become in PK-12 education. Most respondents said that their technology was only moderately aligned with PK-12 classrooms, and highlighting this significant opportunity to grow. There is no institution that claimed that their educational technology was completely aligned with K-12 classroom. Then we looked at some of the stronger relationship in the data, and several were especially interesting. First, there was a strong positive correlation between institution size and how well CMC technology aligned with PK-12 classroom. Larger institutions clearly had more resources with the ability to provide higher access to technology. We also discovered that when faculty viewed librarians as instructional partners, they were significantly more likely to include curriculum collection materials in student assignments. Subject-specific databases instruction was also more common in larger institutions, again, likely a result of being staffing and infrastructure. Librarians who balanced curriculum materials work with other duties were more likely to expect digital transformation to impact CMC services. Perhaps by having broader institutional responsibilities, they can see how those trends are starting to affect their work with curriculum materials. The statistical data tell us that institution size and staffing structure and faculty engagement all shape how curriculum material centers and collections function and how students interact with them. Our research revealed a significant disconnect between the growing advocacy for digital resources and the continuing practical reliance on print materials in CMCs. While 55% of our survey respondents preferred acquiring hard copy K-12 textbooks, an overwhelming 88% endorsed a balanced approach incorporating both formats. Only 15% strongly supported a complete shift over ebooks. Although many reading specialists believe print support better reading comprehension in children, this disconnect isn't just about what format teachers and librarians think is better. It's also about fundamental digital limitations. Publisher licensing models for e-textbooks are a significant problem. They often only allow one user at the time, which doesn't work in curriculum center with multiple students. However, choosing print comes with its own challenges. You need people to catalog and shelf materials, as well as physical space to store multi-volume sets of textbook series. So format decisions both affect and are affected by practical considerations, such as staffing and space. At this point, my colleague Maria will continue.
Responses related to open educational resources highlighted inconsistent adoption and support. About 50% of our survey respondents currently use OER, but institution size seems to be a factor in this. None of the smallest institutions reported using OER, while 60% of larger institutions have adopted open educational resources. This appears almost counterintuitive. The smaller institutions that would benefit most from free adaptable resources are the least likely to implement OER. Time constraints emerged as the most significant barrier, with 60% of respondents indicating they didn't have enough time to evaluate and adapt these materials properly. Other obstacles include awareness issues and quality concerns, each mentioned by 50% of the respondents. For those who successfully integrate OER, the main motivating factors were cost effectiveness, availability of relevant materials, and curriculum alignment. Faculty interest or disinterest played a crucial role also. One respondent noted that even after a substantial push to introduce OER, there was little interest from education faculty members. Responses related to challenges were a consistent theme throughout our survey as well, falling into several categories. 85% reported 85% of respondents identified student engagement as a significant concern. We found a direct connection between faculty requirements and student usage of curriculum material centers or curriculum collections. When professors actively incorporated these materials into coursework, student engagement significantly improved. Time constraints ranked the second largest challenge, with 70% of respondents struggling to balance between CMC or curriculum collection responsibilities with other library duties. As one respondent said, CMCs are not as passive as other library collections, and they require active management and dedicated time. Administrative support presents a mixed picture. While most librarians felt adequately supported by their institutions, nearly a quarter regularly encounter administrative challenges. By contrast, most CMC and educational librarians reported strong faculty support, showing that education professors generally valued pre-K to 12 curriculum resources and collaborated well with librarians. Looking ahead to the next 5 years, 68% of the respondents anticipated financial challenges. Staffing worries followed behind at 55%, while space utilization and technology access ranked at 50 each. One specific technological challenge mentioned was the difficulty in acquiring multi-user ebook licenses for children's literature and textbooks. Despite the challenges, most respondents rated their challenges as moderate rather than severe, and suggesting that while obstacles did exist, they were not insurmountable. Higher education trends. We also asked how broader higher education trends might impact CMCs and curriculum collections in the future. About 2/3 of respondents believe that emerging technologies, such as artificial intelligence and virtual reality, would significantly influence curriculum material centers and collections. There was an interesting split in perspective based on experience. Librarians with over 10 years of experience in the field were more likely to be skeptical about these technologies transforming their centers or collections. 61% of respondents indicated that digital transformation would significantly impact their collections and services. Interesting, librarians with multiple responsibilities outside the CMC were more optimistic about digital transformation. This may be due to their broader engagement with other library services, providing them with insight into how digital tools can be integrated into their CMCs or collections. Meanwhile, those who spent more time directly managing curriculum collections or centers were less convinced digital shifts would dramatically change their work. Pedagogical changes are also a key concern for librarians, with nearly 60% of respondents agreeing that evolving teaching methods will transform the way CMCs operate in the future. Finally, 65% of respondents believe that a shift in institutional priority towards market-driven programs such as robotics, cybersecurity, and health management, for example, would affect their CMCs and curriculum collections. So, what does all this mean? First, faculty-librarian collaboration makes a profound difference. Our data revealed a direct correlation between being perceived as an equal partner by the education faculty and the integration of curriculum materials into coursework. Students are more meaningfully engaged with curriculum resources when these relationships are strong. Second, we need to support hybrid collections, both digital and print. Publishers need to develop more viable licensing models beyond the limited one user, one license approach. We must advocate for flexible terms and sustainable access models for our students. Third, technology integration needs attention. No institution reported complete alignment with pre-K to 12 classroom technology. Most CMCs did not have a dedicated computer lab. Many survey respondents did not teach educational technology. Larger institutions demonstrate better technology alignment, indicating resource disparities that need to be addressed. Fourth, smaller institutions need targeted support through funding, shared resources, and partnerships. This is especially crucial for OER adoption, where smaller institutions struggle the most, despite potentially benefiting the most from free, adaptable resources. And finally, we need to plan strategically for the future, with most survey respondents anticipating financial and staffing challenges in the next 5 years. CMC and education librarians need to keep thinking creatively about sustaining and growing the work of CMCs and curriculum collections in an increasingly constrained educational landscape. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll go into our question and answer time now. So you can either put your questions into the chat, or you can unmute and ask them in audio, whatever you prefer.
I have a question about the University of Nevada at Reno, the library tenure and post-tenure review. I'm sorry, do you also have a post-tenure review? I missed that if you had mentioned that.
We did not look at that in our study. Actually, we are currently working on a part 2. It's not post-tenure review, but we are looking at what are the criteria for going up for full professor or your full promotion, essentially. We don't really have post-tenure review here at UNR, or at least if we thought we remember seeing it somewhere in our documentation, but now we can't find it. But we certainly, in practice, we do not do post-tenure review other than our annual evaluations.
Oh, okay, because that's become a very popular new addition in academia. And we here at Long Island University are getting in. We're part of post-tenure review now. So I was wondering if you were also part of post-tenure review now. But it's good to hear that there is no post-tenure review there yet with you.
There was a question very early on in the chat that I think was answered in the chat, but from Elizabeth White about how do the databases they were showing compare to Education Research Complete, and that was answered that Education Research Complete is part of Education Source. So I wasn't sure if there was any follow-up for that or if that was asked and answered. Samantha Thompson Franklin has a question for Lisa. Did your study survey students on how often they use their high school library?
I did not. So we didn't do a survey. Ours was just, looking at the data that we had from the university department and the Department of Education, and that we gathered for that data that was missing from the California Department of Education. There was the one study that I mentioned. What did I do with my notes already? I think it was the Boyer and Cesar Elliott study. And they did survey. That was a survey of first-year college students, and how they, their experience in their school libraries. So that might be something interesting, if you wanted to look at that and go more in depth about that. They did that survey. I think that would be an interesting follow-up study to a study like this. The students who had the libraries to find out more about, how they interacted with the school libraries, but we didn't conduct a survey.
Thank you. We have a question from Anne Armstrong about for the education database study. I think that's Alissa and you all. Did you look at different levels of education databases offered by EBSCO? For example, Education Research Complete, Education Research Premier, in addition to Education Source.
Fitz, do you want to take that, or Kari's on?
I can. What I was going to show, I'll share. So one of the things that we did is we actually looked fairly close, and there's an appendix that I referenced in another question in the article. And the way that EBSCO does its education products, they're nested, essentially. So Education Source is kind of like a meta database of all of the different education offerings that EBSCO has. So we actually went through and looked at all of the different offerings, and you can see how many titles were offered at the time, and we reviewed those title offerings, those title lists, and determined that they were in fact complete subsets of education source. So in that it's also important to keep in mind that at the point that we had done this, EBSCO had also absorbed the H.W. Wilson Educational Abstracts database as well. So, which is a big change from some of those historical studies that had looked at this. But if you have questions about what education source contains, referencing this appendix in our article is really helpful to kind of getting a lay of how EBSCO has organized their education database products. So
I'll also add, and I just popped this in the chat earlier, EBSCO hadn't yet made, they have another meta product that's slightly bigger than Education Source that was not available at the time. I think it's like Education Ultimate or something. So that wasn't available. That's not included in the appendix just because they hadn't made it available yet.
Yeah, and the question about how each level underneath compares to ERIC, we don't know. That wasn't really our focus here. In part because it would have been we would have needed a much larger team than what we had to be able to have access to the different levels of the products. And what I would say is that there is probably also a use, in fact, Alissa could probably speak to this, of this study where having this information can actually help you as an education librarian advocate for needing a better education database product.
We were able to do that at my institution before the results had been published or even submitted. I was able to send an initial preprint to my dean, and we were able to get permission to get the education source immediately. And that was well before everything started with ERIC. So we were well positioned when things happened. But we had that data and we used it to make a decision.
Yeah, same at University of Massachusetts Amherst.
Thank you. So we have another question. This is for promotion and tenure presenters. Could you please explain again the definition of indefinite continuing appointment? Is that the same as librarians who are reappointed each year as long as they have a good annual review? At a previous institution I was in this classification, all librarians had a continuing indefinite contract.
I don't know if Emily or Elena want to answer this. I'm happy to, but
Go for it, Teresa.
So continuing appointment is kind of it's a term used by certain librarians, like it's a specific term that actually shows up in their bylaws or their other documentation. And it's basically this idea that it's tenure, but we're not going to call it tenure. And so in this idea of an indefinite continuing appointment, you go through a very similar process to tenure. You have your 3 roles. You have your, your general duties, your scholarship, your creative, or your service, sorry. You have to go through some kind of a review process. And then again, usually we weren't tracking how long this process was, but it was about 5 to 6 years for most places, both between tenure and continuing appointment. You go up and it's basically you're in or you're out. If you do not make continuing appointment, you are let go. But then once you get continuing appointment in this idea of an indefinite continuing appointment, you are then always have continuing appointment unless something really major happens like it would in the tenure system. For those that we did not count, what we were seeing in their bylaws or faculty handbook or whatnot, they would go up, they would get continuing appointment, but then after every 5 years, they would have to go up again to maintain it. Or at least that's how we were interpreting the documents. So we decided to make the distinction that if you had that 5-year review process continual, even after getting that initial continuing appointment, then that we did not include those institutions. So this is separate from the annual evaluation process, because most institutions, and we do as well, have an annual evaluation process, but that is really kind of separate from this idea of tenure and promotion. So those were the ones we were focused on, where they had a continuing appointment process that was very similar to tenure and promotion.
Thank you. We have another question. Oh,
Sorry. Oh, I'm just curious to know if you have a faculty union at Reno.
Faculty are not allowed to unionize in the state of Nevada. Hopefully, I don't know how the
I didn't
legislation
know
is.
that.
There's legislation going forth this year. We'll see how it does. I have lost track of it. I don't know, but we are not. Our staff are allowed to. They were recently allowed to unionize, but faculty currently are not.
Okay, thank you.
The next question, and will probably be our last question, is from for Natalia Maria. Did you get a sense of whether academic libraries are more or less likely to start or maintain CMCs in the future? You mentioned staffing challenges that might suggest some pressures in maintaining CMCs.
Maria, would you like to take it away?
That's a really very good question, because let me just give you a little bit of I was, up until right before COVID, I was a CMC librarian for like 40 years. And so, and during that time, I saw and helped a lot of other institutions set up CMCs within the tri-state area. And since then, some of them have closed, which is really sad to see. We closed after, over 40 years of being open. I have a feeling, like everything else in education, it's cyclical, that when education comes back to being, a very popular profession to choose from, then CMCs will come back or get started again. That's the optimist in me. The pessimist in me thinks that because everything, so much is going to online, digital, we might never get space back, but that there will always be some kind of, digital collection. Can I just say one other thing to sort of answer that question? I think what might happen, because everything is collaborative, one word that was prevalent in throughout our survey was collaboration with other librarians, with OER, collaborating with faculty members. I have a feeling that we might not ever get space back that we lost, but that, for example, computer labs and CMCs, but that there will be collaboration with other multi-purpose computer labs on campus, because AI is becoming big in engineering, big in education. So that I hope that answers your question. I think it'll look different. It'll definitely look different.
Well, thank you, and thank you everyone for attending today's research forum. I have put the link to the presentation slides as well as a link to our feedback survey in the chat, so please do those. And we look forward to seeing you again next year.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.